Hey everyone, it's Jason Turner. If you're anything like me, you may enjoy horror movies. I have loved horror movies for many, many years, and it seems like there just aren't a lot of great ones coming out anymore. Maybe I'm just old school, but I like old school horror movies. I love movies with ghosts in them too. If you have ever heard of these two, these came out in the 90s. This is The Grudge and The Ring. These were pretty prominent in the 90s. Like I said, they were remakes of Japanese ghost story movies, Ju-on and Ringu. And if you ever heard of these, you may notice there are commonalities in these ghosts. And there were other movies that came out that had similar looking ghosts, Shutter and Dark Water. They have a distinct look. They're women. They have long black hair and wear long white flowing garments. I'd always wondered what that was all about. And so I looked into it a bit, and it turns out that the elements and the ghosts themselves have their roots in Japanese religion, Japanese tradition, and folklore. And I'm going to share a little bit of that background with you. I did some research on encyclopedia.com to look at Japanese history. And as far as religious practices go, the Japanese practice religion that is comprised of two primary ones, and that's Shintoism, which is the oldest. Shintoism is based on deities that ruled the heavens. There are two in particular, Izanami and Izanagi. And Izanagi there is holding the spear. Legend has it that there were water droplets that came out of the blade of that spear, fell to earth, and created the Japanese islands. Then these two deities went and inhabited those islands and had a lot of offspring. The most primary and most revered offspring was Amaterasu, which is the universal sun goddess. She's very highly revered in Japanese culture even today. There were emperors that ruled Japan a long time ago that claimed that they were direct lineage and had the right to rule. She signifies giving life and again, highly revered. And because she's female, that kind of sprung off a lot of folklore and things like that. And that's one of the reasons that women are depicted in some of these ghost stories, and the ones that I mentioned to you. Now, in 6th century CE, which stands for Common Era, that's the equivalent of AD for us. That's when Buddhism was introduced into Japan. And Japan took a lot of customs and traditions from Buddhist religion. And today, for example, 90% of funeral processions are done in a Buddhist tradition, whereas Shintoism is also prevalent, and most weddings are done with a Shinto tradition. So again, there's the amalgamation of both. Buddhism had ghost stories as well, but the spirits in the Buddhist religion were really genderless, whereas Shinto religion had a distinction in ghosts of men and women. And women came up a lot in ghost stories. I went to a site called japantalk.com, and it talked about 6 distinctive ghosts in the Japanese folklore. The one that rose to the top was the Onyo. And here we go. If you're mentioning those movies that I talked about, you've got this image right here, the long black hair, the long white garb. These were vengeful spirits. They were primarily women who had been neglected or even abused by their lovers. They often died in despair and grief and mourning, which did not allow them to rest. They didn't cross over to the other side after they died, but rather they stayed on earth to seek vengeance upon the living. And interestingly enough, they didn't often seek vengeance on those that harmed them, but rather people that just simply were in their path would be harmed. And you kind of have to understand a little bit of the traditional roles of women in Japan. I looked at a site called japanpower.com that talked about those traditional roles. Those roles are kind of changing more currently, but traditionally women were subservient to men. Women in general had 3 submissive parts to their lives. When they were younger, they submitted to their fathers. When they were married, they submitted to their husbands. And when they were older, they submitted to their sons. So it's I don't want to say they didn't have their own identity, but they weren't like the modern woman who says, I'm going to, have a career here, a career there. This is my dream. I'm going to go get it. These women were expected, since they were identified as childbearers, they were expected to stay home. Men would go away and work for long hours, sometimes days, leaving the women at home to do all of the housework, keeping house. and raising the children. So you can kind of see where maybe there might have been some despair and loneliness and neglect in their hearts. Men, were known to come home and treat them as secondary and often be mean to them. So that plays into that legend as well of the woman scorned, if you will, because of how she was treated in her life. Now, the long black hair is pretty interesting. I looked at a few sites regarding that. Monsterpedia.com is the one I'll reference particularly. They stated that the long black hair, and I read this a couple other places too, that goes back to Kabuki theater, and you're probably familiar with Kabuki theater. Very famous in Japan, been around for a long, long time. There is no spoken word, but with lavish costumes and makeup and wigs, they act out stories with musical accompaniment. Often there can be a few regular instruments in there, but it's a lot of percussion in the background. And according to Encyclopedia Britannica, in 1653, Japanese authorities mandated that only men could do kabuki theater. Women were barred altogether. So they had to come up with some costume changes that would allow the audience to see that there was a distinction between a man and a woman, and even ghosts. There were a lot of ghost stories being told. So what they came up with to symbolize ghosts were ones with certain white makeup and long black hair. So audiences over time would see this image and know that it was a ghost. So there's that black hair playing into this Onya that I've been speaking about. As far as the white garb, you have to understand that color is symbolic in many ways to the Japanese, and some of those symbolisms are very different than in American culture. Again, Buddhism makes up 90% of the funeral traditions, and in Buddhist religion, white symbolizes sorrow, grieving, and despair. To us, we think of it as purity and innocence, but to them, sorrow and despair. So even though you may see funeral goers these days wearing black, it's generally the deceased that are wrapped in white and have been for many, many centuries. So this is funeral garb. The white signifies sorrow. So again, tying this into these famous ghosts that I've been talking about, the black hair now stems from Kabuki theater, the white garb from sorrow and the funeral garb. The women are the vengeful ghosts who've been mistreated in their lives and are seeking vengeance upon the living. Very interesting. If you haven't seen these movies, they are quite chilling, especially the originals if you like atmosphere and a feeling of dread. The American remakes are a little different, a little more special effects, a little more fast-paced, but both are very good on their own right. If you haven't seen them and you like horror movies, definitely check them out. I really enjoyed this topic. I hope you did too. Thanks for watching.